Good day, folks. Thanks for coming to Finding the One for Our Son here at Madison 365. I am your host, Matthew Browngan. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts. Yeah, I think so. And Spotify? Yeah, I think I said that. Anyways, good day, folks. So, if you haven't been paying attention these past couple of weeks, a Des Moines Register reporter, Andrea Sahouri, I should have made sure to listen to her name pronounced before I did that, was being charged with, failure to disperse after covering some Black Lives Matter protests this past summer. Now, what's really interesting to me about this is the fact that a lot of folks who have decried cancel culture from the left and all these things of basically saying so-called social justice warriors are attempting to impose draconian language and behavior on folks and attempting to suppress free speech, have been very silent about this. And in a way, she's not alone. In one way, she is. But really, bottom line, here's the thing. Cancel culture does not exist, at least not in the way that we, within the larger discourse of what it is, or in the larger so-called discourse of cancel culture, or accusations of it, don't exist. There is a special irony to folks saying those of an oppressed population calling for accountability or just criticizing those who have expressed racist opinions, views, statements, sexist, statements are, that the accusation of these folks taking part in cancel culture. It's really ironic, especially when we take into account, well, really, this is where it is, the history of the federal government of white people killing and silencing and arresting leftists and black populations. Or such as, or even private companies, such as like the Seuss folks, right? Pulling a few books from being published anymore. That's it. Because of the racist caricatures that were in them. They're not saying burn it. They're saying it's no longer, or it wasn't even at that time, but these things aren't appropriate. We've evolved past it. And while I'll say these things are important to preserve for history, it doesn't mean it doesn't mean these books are being burned. It doesn't mean they're being destroyed. These things should be saved, put in a museum, talked about, all right? But that doesn't mean it's, they're canceling Dr. Seuss. And largely this has been a right-wing cry, although there's been some folks, self-described leftists and moderates, that have taken part in this. And we'll kind of talk about that in a little bit, about their role in how they talk about cancel culture. We're going to be jumping back and forth a bit between right-wing accusations and folks that are self-described moderates and leftists. Oftentimes, the most common denominator is that they're mostly white men. That can tell us a lot about this. But when a private company removes a book, that isn't suppression of speech. This is a misread of the First Amendment, which is literally just about basically preventing the federal government from prosecuting journalists and residents for speaking out against the government. That's it. It just means not the federal, it just means the government can't go after you for speaking out against the government. Unfortunately, that isn't always true, and particularly this is much more true when it comes to folks that are coming from the left, and particularly black and brown folks, which have literally been assassinated by the government. The FBI took part in the assassination of Fred Hampton, setting up other Black Panthers and being arrested and being killed. That is cancel culture. And this reporter, for example, is part of that. She was being targeted by the federal government, or by the state government, even though she was acquitted by a jury, these are real charges she faced. And it just so happened also she ID'd herself as a journalist. She was the only journalist arrested, but she also happened to be the only journalist of color on the scene at that time. But these accusations ignore even more, as there were journalists arrested across the summer at Black Lives Matter protests. The U.S. Press Freedom Tracker confirmed 238 press freedom violations in 2020, including physical assaults, arrests, and equipment searches and seizures, more than 3/4 which occurred while journalists were documenting Black Lives Matter protests. They were targeted by police across the nation. There's videos of this, mounting evidence. Yet, where are these, cancel culture warriors, if you will, in decrying that type of behavior by the government, silencing journalists? All right. These same people are ignoring. There have been professors fired from universities for, in their own time, speaking out in support of Black Lives Matter. Or Kentucky is looking to pass a bill making it illegal to swear and criticize police officers in a protest. Oklahoma is proposing a bill to ban the teaching of sexual gender diversities in schools. Where are these people at this? It also ignores bills being passed by states where drivers can legally drive into protests blocking roads, effectively deputizing, is a history of this, white people to target and violently target black protests. Because we know if a black person did this at, say, a Proud Boy protest, that black person would be charged in those states, as we can recognize that with the history of stand your ground laws, which basically don't apply to black people. It almost seems every time those that get up in arms about so-called cancel culture, it happens when oppressed populations dare to bring criticism or calls for accountability against someone being racist, sexist, homophobic, etc., but are quiet when it comes to government suppression, are quiet when the Trump administration barred diversity training. Why? It's also hard to nail down a definition of what cancel culture is. It's a very nebulous, ever-shifting definition that tends to expand or contract based upon whatever the writer or the person making the accusation of it need it to be. This is much more similar to the Red Scare than what they actually accuse of these, our press groups are doing. Now, do moments of stupid outrage exist? Of course, absolutely. But I would argue there's few and far in between that are actually just dumb moments of stupid outrage. And most of these folks aren't actually even being so-called canceled. They aren't being sent to gulags. They aren't being erased from history. Some have faced consequences of their accusations, but most don't. And if they do, it ends up being minimal. Very few have ended up losing jobs. Some have lost promotions. More often than not, though, these folks that they claim their speech has been silenced and have been oppressed find jobs pretty easily. And they say some pretty terrible, horrible things. Most don't, particularly for conservative. And actually, a lot of these same people that decry this have attempted to get people fired. Shoot, I mean, Madison's own Sly, on one hand, I know has talked at great lengths about so-called cancel culture, but at one point tried to get me fired from working at UW-Madison for a interview I gave on my own time, off the clock, practicing my own free speech. He disagreed with it. He felt I was attacking some of his police friends and tried to get me fired from UW-Madison. But I know he's talked about cancel culture. So what is it? All right? What is it? Because the idea that only the left and that this is something new has a reflex of canceling things is quite a preposterous accusation. These same folks have ignored the behavior Oftentimes, again, these older white men, more often than not, of their own times in power, of particularly those from the Christian right. Franklin Graham in 2015 wanted to ban the Muppets. Christian groups protested a lesbian ad by Chobani, the yogurt. Christian groups wanted to take out the show Lucifer, wanted to take it off the air. How about even the explicit labels on albums came about because of rap music? People were calling rap to be canceled. There were entire congressional hearings on the dangers of rap music. How about claims that rock and roll were the devil's music? You know, again, they were very silent when Trump actually canceled diversity trainings. And while it is true that a lot of us have said and done things that we might not do now in the past, if someone dug these things up, I wouldn't run from it. I wouldn't hide from it. The way to show that you've grown, that it was indeed a mistake, a failure mindset, is to own up to it. Say, yes, I did that. I'm sorry to everyone I harmed. I accept responsibility for my actions, whatever you, the impacted people, deem it may be, and I'm here for accountability that I must face. It's also important in that aspect to not just do that, but explain why it was harmful and unacceptable. And the steps you've learned since then to behave differently. How did you educate yourself? Who did you listen to? Who did you read? What was said that impacted you? Walk us through that. Show and talk about the ways you've grown. Don't pass it off as a past or youthful mistake. Talk about your evolution of where you've been and your understanding of why that behavior, that opinion, that thought was wrong, and accept the accountability you must face now. And if you see something, it's about also beginning that now. A lot of us recognize our behavior when it's wrong, but we don't do enough to make sure it doesn't happen again. But I also have a question. For folks that believe there is indeed a cancel culture of what it is described in popular discourse, what do you believe are the appropriate consequences for racist, sexist, or homophobic behavior, actions, or words should be? How about somebody in power behaving in that manner? Should they hold that power, continue to do so? And why do you think it was just a one-off? Why is there this need to defend these people so much while ignoring the persecution of those they harmed? For example, we know implicit bias training doesn't really work. There's the data is there. And in fact, actually, a better thing is we don't know how, if implicit bias, the evidence is there that it does, how it's currently being implemented doesn't work. We don't know if there's a better way to do it, but we know right now the way it's done doesn't work. So what we hear, though, is that accountability shouldn't happen. Just because they say they're sorry or they go through a training, is that enough, really? Saying you're sorry doesn't show growth. It doesn't show you understand. And the question remains, why do they talk about it to begin with? Why do they say that to begin with? And how has that mentality that brought them to say or do what they did impacted their ability to do their job? Right? It's really just so-called cancel culture, and those with less power are trying to hold those with more power accountable for their actions. Why is that bad? And why is this being brushed off as minor mistakes? Are folks scared because they might think the same things? And again, this isn't, about free speech in the constitutional sense. Again, that's about the government, not private entities, not the public demanding accountability for people that have caused harm. You might say their life has been ruined while ignoring the fact they may have ruined others' lives, that they hurt people. Now, there's a conversation about what might be better ways to hold people, institutions accountable. That's a real conversation. Because really all I see is that this public outcry is a way to hold people accountable when there aren't better mechanisms to do so. So let's think, maybe that's the path to go down. But again, we don't have the mechanisms right now. So people are trying in any which way to hold people accountable. Now, another irony of this claim of cancel culture is that they are doing what they claim they don't want us to do. It's a silencing call. It is saying our ideas aren't worth debating about. It is having an intolerance for ideas and actions they don't agree with. It's an accusation of itself. It isn't an exploration of why people have called for accountability for folks who have made a racist statement or action. It's basically saying, shut up, you're wrong. It is indeed an intolerance to ideas that they might disagree with, in an attempt to silence those ideas. It's the very essence of labeling something cancel culture is the behavior they claim to decry. If they embrace our idea, they would earnestly engage in finding ways to hold people accountable for perpetuating oppression. The right to speech doesn't mean a right to platform. The right to speech doesn't mean free from accountability from your peers. The right to speech doesn't mean we should take your ideas seriously. And it's not being afraid of ideas, and it's really interesting even then. Again, hypocrisy or whatever you want to call it, many of these same folks decrying cancel culture are also first in line, rightfully so, on accusations of left-wing anti-Semitism for accountability while ignoring much more severe right-wing instances of it. I'm looking at you, Glenn Greenwald. Even more so, people, particularly those that are right-leaning, who aren't not right-leaning, sorry, those who aren't conservative, are upset at the platforming of climate change scientists, anti-climate change scientists. Sorry about that, and giving there's both sides of them to climate change or other types of things they agree with. They want to get rid and deplatform these folks that bring on anti-climate change science, which isn't really science propaganda, and rightfully so. It's a dangerous belief with no role in discourse. But yet again, they believe that we should take seriously racist ideas and beliefs or statements, that we should focus more on intent than impact. It's not that intent doesn't matter. It's that the impact is more important. Say if you accidentally kill somebody with your car, but may not intend to do so, but you did, you will face consequences. And it's not that the intent doesn't matter, it's weighted, but your impact still rightfully matters. It's why you will face consequences. And let's say we might agree, bringing this back out to racism. If we can recognize implicit bias exists, which is basically just unconscious racism you're perpetuating in this context, it means so-called small, well-intentioned comments suggest a larger impact, not just on the individual in that moment. It suggests that if that person is in a policy-making position, if that person is in a position of power, then they bring along that same mindset that led to those comments or actions and to how they operate within that institution system, then perpetuating institutional or systemic or racism, particularly through policies and et cetera. So even well-meaning folks with this bias, with this form of racism, can perpetuate institutional racism. So should that person be in a position to, perpetuate oppression, even if they're not intended to do so? So what ideas do so-called cancel culture folks, do those accused of cancel culture not have tolerance for racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia? Why is intolerance for those things wrong? Would someone say we should have an earnest debate about climate change? Or if the Earth is round or not? Or if we're at the center of our solar system? Of course not. And part of how those ideas won out wasn't just through intellectual debate. And to say that there isn't an intellectual debate about these things is absolutely wrong. It means you're not paying attention. But it also means that there's a complete dismissal of some of these other ideas, the deplatforming of these ideas that aren't worth debate. So then another question is, why do you feel it necessary to defend racist thoughts and actions? Why do you believe these ideas are worthy to debate or serious consideration? Why do you think that you get to decide what is worthy of debate and what isn't? Why do you feel the need to dictate the terms so much? Why are you scared of people being held accountable for perpetuating racism at various degrees, regardless of intent? Why must intent be the purpose here, not the impact? It seems cancel culture, again, doesn't apply to police across the nation targeting reporters. States attempting to bar the 1619 Project from being taught, the long history of Black and brown revolutionary folks being barred and authors being barred from schools, professors on the left being fired. Black revolutionary political prisoners are still in jail. Assad Shakur is still living in exile. But these folks don't talk about these things. Or the thousands of people lynched, beaten, attempted just to live. Doesn't count for Black people being targeted by police. It only seems to count when it's someone with relative privilege being or perpetuating oppression, and people from the oppressed group demanding accountability. So people from oppressed groups recognize that these mostly white men either fail to or deny in bad faith that these seemingly individual actions aren't individual. We know that if someone behaved that way in that moment, probably did before. Again, this is about consequences. Freedom of speech does not mean freedom from consequences. And it's just as we as society have long held consequences for people who have acted in ways the public deemed bad. But it wasn't cancel culture when it was mostly white men deciding what was appropriate and what wasn't. The difference now is that the populations demanding consequences are no longer mostly white men. The charge of cancel culture is the same as labeling someone as PC police in the 90s, or as calling those that were fighting for Black freedom, communists and socialists, which is a mixed accusation as many of them were socialists, but this was used as an attempt to silence. The labels of cancel culture are an attempt to silence oppressed groups for speaking out against their oppression. And it's a vile statement, because these are real people having their free speech being threatened by aspects of our government. They'd rather point the finger at oppressed people saying you're hurting us than at the powerful people, mostly white men, acting to suppress speech. And again, the energy spent by moderates and white leftists on this is on looking at people of color and oppressed groups, speaking out and calling for accountability. Many of them flat out ignore what's going on at the right in a lot of ways. Ignoring the massive rollback of voting rights, maybe giving it a passing mention, but don't spend nearly the same amount of time or energy on this stuff. Or on again, the government actually doing suppression of speech. Effectively, they're giving cover to white nationalists and the white nationalist party of their oppressive propaganda, because these accusations of cancel culture really started out and coming from the right. It validates their white nationalist rhetoric. And attempting, again, to silence those disagree with. They're taking part in the exact behavior they criticize. And again, the only difference is the people doing this are mostly white men with access to power, tossing around these accusations, attempting to silence oppressed groups. And it lets us know where you stand against oppression. But that is it. Thanks for coming to Finding More for Our Son here at Madison 365. I'm Matthew Brown, your host. If you can, get yourself vaccinated. Stay safe. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts. And yeah, I think that's it. Anyways, thanks for coming and have yourselves a good week. Thanks. Bye.
This is 365 Media.